You're tuned into the Spot-Up Pod, the official podcast of the Spot-Up Shot newsletter. I'm your host, Paul Garcia. In today's episode, the Spurs swept their last 4 games against the Clippers, Kings, Suns, and Pacers. Looking at the Spurs' shooting from each area of the floor this season through 71 games, and finally, previewing the upcoming games for this week. All right, welcome back to another episode of the Spot-Up Pod. Let's go through a breakdown of the 4 games from this past week. So let's go back to Monday. The Spurs are on the road in Los Angeles to play the Clippers. The Spurs were favored by 8.5 points. There was no Dylan Harper and no Luke Kornet for the Spurs, but the Clippers were missing their best player in Kawhi Leonard, who was out dealing with an ankle injury. So the story of this game, the Clippers came out well, with a 14-point lead early on in the game. The Spurs did make a comeback, and then they made that comeback by holding the Clippers to 15 points in the second quarter, and then the Spurs built a big lead by as much as 24 points. The Clippers bench, though, in the second half did come back to cut into that Spurs lead. And the Spurs rotation players had to play pretty late into the fourth there as the game did get down to crunch time, but the Spurs did hold on by 4 points. There were 4 standout Spurs in this game. The first one was Stephon Castle. He ends up with 23 points, 7 rebounds, 8 assists. He scored 16 paint points. He had a really nasty behind the back dribble against Brook Lopez in that game. That was very notable. That made the highlight reel. Then Devin Vassell had a good night with 20 points, went 4-7 from three-point land on a night that most of the team did struggle from outside. So again, the team as a whole, the Spurs, they struggled from outside, but Devin was one of those bright spots with his outside shooting. Victor Wembanyama ends up with 21 points, 13 rebounds, and 4 blocks. He scored 12 paint points. He had 4 alley-oop finishes, which ties his season high in alley-oop finishes in a single game, but he did struggle from 3, going 2 of 9 from outside. And then finally, De'Aaron Fox had a pretty good night with 18 points and 6 rebounds. He put another double-digit paint scoring game together, but he also struggled from outside, going 0 of 4 from deep. The Spurs and Clippers do have one matchup left in LA on April 2nd, and that's going to be important that we might hopefully get to see these teams both at full strength, because this could be a potential round 1 matchup. If the Clippers get back into that 7th or 8th place spot. I know that they've been slipping lately, but if they do get there, then that could be a potential round 1 matchup. So maybe we see both teams at full strength on that final game in April 2nd between the two teams. All right, then we go to Tuesday. The Spurs are on the second night of a back-to-back in Sacramento. That was why it was important that the starters or the rotation players didn't play late into the game against the Clippers on Monday, but they did. So the Spurs were favored by 13.5 points because the Kings, are one of the bottom teams out west. There was no Devin Vassell for this game, but the Kings were missing multiple rotation players. Keegan Murray was out, Zach LaVine, Domantas Sabonis, DeAndre Hunter, Malik Monk, even former Spur Drew Eubanks, and even second-year player Devin Carter. So again, a lot of Kings players have been out for Sacramento. The Spurs went up by double digits early in the first quarter. Then they just basically dominated, building a lead as high as 38 points several times. The reserves for San Antonio did close out the game, and the team made a new franchise record, 25 threes, where I kind of did a little film breakdown over on the spotupshot.com. If you want to check out that film breakdown of the Spurs' franchise record, 25 made threes. There were 3 players who stood out for the Spurs in this game. De'Aaron Fox against his former team ends up with 15 points, 5 rebounds, and 6 assists in 22 minutes. Victor Wembanyama has another good night going against one of his former French teammates back in France, Maxime Reynaud, where Wemby ends up with 18 points, 8 rebounds, 1 block in 22 minutes. And then Harrison Barnes against his former team as well had a good night with 16 points, went 4 of 5 from deep in 22 minutes, and he did start in place of Barnes of Devin Vassell, who was out for this game. So again, the Spurs pick up a pretty easy win on Tuesday in Sacramento. Now let's go to Thursday. The Spurs are back home in San Antonio. They're hosting the Phoenix Suns. The Spurs were favored by 9.5 points in this game. There was no Stephon Castle for this game, but the Suns were missing Dylan Brooks, Grayson Allen, and Mark Williams. For the Suns, they were all out. So this was actually a very close game throughout. Phoenix led for most of the game, I will say. The Spurs, their largest lead was only 6 points, whereas the Suns, their largest lead was 11. And then we get down to crunch time. It's a single possession game. Here comes Victor Wembanyama's time. With 10.8 seconds left, Wemby makes his first career go-ahead basket with 10 seconds left, going to his right and making a pull-up jumper over Oso Ighodaro with 1.1 seconds left. Devin Booker tried to, throw up a half-court heave, but he missed, and so the Spurs ended up winning a very close win by 1 point. That win was very significant, not only because it was one of Victor's first game winners in the NBA, but also because this win officially got the Spurs into the 25-26 playoffs. They are guaranteed a top 6 place in the playoffs now by getting that win. So it ends their playoff drought, a place that they have not been in since 2018-19. So again, even though we know the Spurs were going to get into the playoffs, obviously based on the record, they're the second best team out west. Mathematically, it hadn't got into that point until that win against Phoenix. There was one Spur who really stuck out in this game, and that was Victor Wembanyama. He ends up with 34 points, 12 rebounds, 3 steals, 1 block in 35 minutes. He scored 12 paint points and matched his season high of 12 made free throws. And his free throws were critical because, again, this was a 1-point win. And so on this night, Victor went 12 of 12 perfect from the free throw line. I also want to mention how the Spurs, they did go they're now 2-2 against Phoenix, and it's just interesting to watch that matchup because that is also a matchup that could potentially be a round 1 matchup for the Spurs in that 2-7 matchup. If Phoenix ends up winning their play-in game and they stay in the 7th place spot right now is where they're at. And the reason why I say that is because if we look at the series as a whole, again, the teams went 2-2 against each other. We saw that in the first early meetings of November, the Suns won those games both at home, pretty well. They really gave the Spurs a lot of trouble, and for those games, Dylan Brooks was present for I think 1 or 2 of them, and then also Grayson Allen was in one of those. And so again, the Suns did look early on like they were a team that were giving the Spurs trouble. Well, then we go to that game in Austin a few weeks ago. I think it was before or after the All-Star break. The Spurs blew out the Suns easily on that one. But again, Brooks was out, Grayson Allen was out, a few other players, plus Devin Booker got hurt in that game pretty early. I think it was early in the second quarter or even the first quarter. And so we didn't really get a good matchup between the two teams. And then, of course, this last one, we saw again, even though the Suns were missing several rotation players, they did give the Spurs' offense a lot of fits there. Where San Antonio, it was partly that they had a tough time, shooting the basketball from outside, but also just their kind of different kind of zone looks that they were giving, the Spurs, and really trying to cut off the paint, have multiple bodies inside. Again, that's just a team to kind of watch for the Spurs as they go into the playoffs here pretty soon in a few weeks if Phoenix ends up being the round 1 opponent, because we didn't quite get a full matchup of both teams at full strength against each other. But in the glimpses we saw, we did see that in 3 of those games, Phoenix did give San Antonio some trouble. And now for the final game of the week, the Spurs were back at home hosting the Indiana Pacers on Saturday. Obviously, the Pacers have been struggling. They're one of the worst teams in the entire league. So the Spurs were favored by 16.5 points. There was no Stephon Castle or Devin Vassell, both players out due to injury. But because they were both out, that meant that Dylan Harper got to get his first career start. And then, of course, we know that the Pacers have been dealing with injuries all season. So they're missing, of course, their best player, Tyrese Halliburton. And then even Ivica Zubac, who they traded for in February, was out of this game. He's going to miss the remainder of the season as well. So the Spurs led by double digits pretty much for most of the game. Indiana did get within 8 once in the third quarter, but again, the Spurs responded, held that double-digit lead for most of the night. So again, a pretty comfortable win for San Antonio. The lead got as high as 28 points, and the reserves closed out the fourth quarter for the Spurs, where they ended up winning by 15 points. All right, the Spurs had 3 top players for this game. First player was Keldon Johnson, ends up with 24 points, 4 rebounds, and 4 assists in 25 minutes off the bench. Keldon was really giving the Pacers a lot of trouble inside, just attacking them over and over for 14 paint points. It was his 11th game of the season with 20 or more points off the bench, which basically adds a really good game to his Sixth Man of the Year candidacy resume. Coach Johnson was asked basically, does he think that Keldon, should be a Sixth Man of the Year, candidate or player this year, winner this year? And Coach Johnson basically said yes, that he thinks that there hasn't been a better player, for that Sixth Man role than Keldon this year. Of course, again, it's the coach saying that, but just letting you know that the media are the ones who end up voting on the Sixth Man of the Year award and all the other end of year awards. But I will say Keldon for sure has a chance of being in the top 3 there, as I've discussed here on this podcast. And if he has a few more strong games like he had Saturday, again, he could be the front runner to end up winning that award for Sixth Man of the Year. Keldon's had a very good season. Also a player who's had a good season, usually off the bench next to Keldon, is Dylan Harper. But like I said, the Rook got his first career start, and he really showed up with 24 points, matching a season high. 4 rebounds and 3 assists. He had a very strong game attacking the Pacers inside the paint. They really couldn't keep him out of the paint with 16 paint points. He also got to the free throw line multiple times and ends up making 5 free throws. So again, for the rookie, it was just a one-night career start with both 2 starters out in Vassell and Castle. But again, he showed that if he needs to be a starter, he can do that role as well. And then Victor Wembanyama, of course, has another good game. I mean, in limited minutes, Wemby almost had a 5x5. Listen to his stat line: 20 points, 8 rebounds, 6 assists, 5 blocks, and 1 steal in 26 minutes. So again, 4 A steal shy of a 5x5 for Victor. Again, he dominated in the paint, 12 paint points. He now has scored double-digit paint points in 5 straight games. Again, that's the longest stretch for him this season. Again, 5 consecutive games, double-digit paint points. So again, this is when I think Victor is at his most dangerous. The early Wemby we saw early on in the year before he got injured was that Wemby who's just dominating in the paint, and teams really can't keep him out. And again, that's very scary because this is something that teams have said. Coaches are saying this in their pregame press conferences. They're like, we want to try to load up on the Spurs, try to keep them out of the paint, try to keep Victor against the rim, away from the rim. And sure enough, look what's happening. He's just living inside right now. Whether it's him just kind of like getting the ball, catching and making his move, attacking inside, or his teammates finding him for alley-oops, on cuts, on rolls. That's the thing is, like, even as teams are trying to they're saying, we're going to try to keep the Spurs out of the paint, the Spurs are still getting into the paint, and especially Victor. So again, that's a really good sign going into the playoffs pretty soon that Victor's actually getting more comfortable about getting into the paint, or if not, going to his 3-ball and really taking the mid-range out of his shot diet a little bit more. I know that was the one shot he went to on a game winner, but again, if we've looked lately, he really hasn't gone to those mid-range jumpers as often, and it's mainly just living in the paint or from outside lately for Victor. One coach's quote I want to kind of talk about here was one by Rick Carlisle, the head coach of the Pacers. Obviously, we know that Coach Carlisle won a championship with the Dallas Mavericks, multiple years ago. He also went to the NBA Finals last year with Indiana, had a chance to win it there in Game 7, but of course, we know that Tyrese Halliburton ended up getting hurt, so who knows what could have happened. Maybe he'd have 2 rings by now if Halliburton doesn't get hurt. Anyway, so again, you take what Coach Carlisle says with a lot of a lot more emphasis because he's been there, he's done that. He's coached championship level teams before. So he was asked post game about his thoughts on the Spurs if they're really championship contenders, because obviously we know the story with the Spurs is, of course, they're having an excellent season, really surpassing expectations. But the one thing they really don't have is playoff experience, with a lot of their young players never being in the playoffs. Of course, players like Wemby, Castle, Harper, it's their first time. Even the young guys like Devin Vassell and Harrison and Keldon Johnson, who have been here for a number of years, they have never been in the playoffs because the Spurs were always losing during their first few years in the league. They have veteran players who have been in the playoffs, guys like Harrison Barnes, Luke Cornett, De'Aaron Fox. But again, someone like Fox has only been there once. Cornett has won a title, but again, he was more a role player on that Celtics team. Barnes, has been in several playoff matchups too. But again, these aren't like the go-to outside of Fox. Those kind of guys aren't the go-to guys every night that the Spurs are going to be relying on, and that's why it's going to be important for the younger guys like Victor, Stephon Castle, Dylan Harper, all those kind of guys. Fox. They're one of the small handful that's a legit championship contender. I think that's obvious. What are they? 21-2 in their last 23 games. They've beaten Oklahoma three times. They're mowing people down, and I don't think it's a secret anymore. So that was Coach Carlisle, again, when asked if the Spurs are a championship contender, saying, yes, from what he's seeing, basically what the Spurs are doing right now and how they've taken care of some of those top teams like Oklahoma City. Yeah, he definitely, and how they're they're just basically, beating down a lot of teams, beating them by 15, 20 points per night lately. Carlisle says that, yes, in his opinion, the Spurs are a title contender. So again, you really take his words with a lot of emphasis because he's been there and he's done that, they're at the championship level. So this ended up being a good week for the Spurs. Even though they had to squeak out some wins against the Clippers and the the Suns, they ended up going 4-0. That was my prediction. I thought that they would go 4-0. Vegas also thought they'd go 4-0. So they basically met expectations and did what they needed to do this past week. There was no slip-ups. Through 71 games as of Sunday afternoon that I'm recording this episode, I do want to say that mathematically, the Spurs only need 4 more wins to clinch a top 2 spot out west. However, when we look at based on projected records, the Los Angeles Lakers, who are currently 3rd, are only projected for 53 wins. The Spurs currently have 53 wins, and they have the tiebreaker. So essentially, even though mathematically the Spurs haven't clinched the top 2 spot out west, they're basically there based on where the Lakers are heading. So again, we'll just wait till they officially get there for a top 2 spot, but they're going to get there. Look where they're at, or at least it shows based on projected records that they are going to get there. All right, for my next topic, let's look at the Spurs' shooting breakdown so far through 71 games of the season. So on Friday, I wrote my 70-game review of the Spurs, like I usually do after every 10 games. If you read my work over on thespotupshot.com, or I've even done a few of those breakdowns here on the podcast before. Anyway, what I came away with some big takeaways were, of course, the Spurs still remain elite defensively. They're still a top 5 defense, currently 3rd as of Sunday afternoon. But what I really noticed was that they made an improvement from jumping in, I think they were 8th underneath that game 60, and they moved all the way now into top 5 level, by game 70. As of today, Sunday afternoon, they're actually 4th offensively in the NBA. So again, the Spurs now have a top 5 offense and a top 5 defense. The defense, of course, like we said, that's always been the expectation that they were going to be really good and hold that spot. It was the offense, the fact that, that was the questionable part of their team coming into the season. And so the fact that they've actually gone from like top 10 for most of the year now all the way up to top 5, I kind of wanted to look at the shooting breakdown for the team through 71 games, see where they're at. And so I'm going to look at mainly the rotation players, who are in the lineup every night for the Spurs, and really looking at the growth that a lot of their questionable shooters have made lately since February 1st. So since February 1st, a lot of their players who have really struggled from 3 this year have really, increased their accuracy. They were shooting the ball a lot better. Stephon Castle, since February 1st, he's making 39% of his threes. Dylan Harper, rookie, first time in the NBA. He's now making 40% of his threes since February 1st. Carter Bryant, another rookie, only gets spot minutes, early in the year. Now he's getting real rotation minutes every night. His accuracy is up to 37% since February 1st. And then a lot of other guys are actually shooting well since February 1st. Harrison Barnes is back up to 43% since February 1st. Julian Champagnie and Devin Vassell, the two go-to three-point shooters, are both 41% or better since February 1st. And even Keldon Johnson is at 36% since February 1st. The only two players who's seen a little bit of decline is Wemby. I mean, he's still fine. He's basically where he's supposed to be at 35%. And then De'Aaron Fox is struggling, though. Fox is probably the only rotation player struggling from 3 at this point since February 1st, making just 31% of his threes. So, again, that's very significant that since February 1st, all their players, pretty much all the rotation players, have improved in three-point accuracy, especially their players who struggled for most of the year, like the young guards. And so, now that we know that, let's kind of put all this data from February 1st into the full season data, and let's go through a breakdown of each area of the floor where the Spurs shoot from, and I just want to give my thoughts here. And if you're watching this on video, I really implore you to do that, because I'm going to have each chart with all the numbers on there. I'm not going to go as detailed here on the audio version. So again, watch the video over on thespotupshot.com or on YouTube if you have a chance. Follow the Spot Up Pod. All right, so let's begin with the above the break three. This is the center of around the arc basically. This is the furthest 3-point distance. It is 23.9 feet, so it is a little bit tougher of a three to make, and it has a lower accuracy percentage because of that. So for the season, everyone is getting at least a point per shot except Fox, Castle, and Harper. Again, this is full season data. Fox is shooting 30% on above the break threes, Castle 31%, and Harper 28%. But even those numbers for Castle and Harper have risen since most of the season. The top 4 players who are hitting at least who get most of their shots from here, their percentage of shots, are Julian Champagnie, Devin Vassell, Wemby, and Carter Bryant, and they're all shooting 34% or better from this range. One thing I need to note, though, when regarding three-point shooting, is that even though Luke Kornet is in the rotation, we do need to mention that Kornet doesn't take any threes. So again, Kornet's not involved in any of this data because he doesn't take any threes. Next up, let's look at the corners. Again, this is a shot that's way more, it has a higher value because it's a shorter distance. It's only 22 feet, but this is also a shot that a lot of teams want to try to keep players away from, especially good shooters, because that's a more dangerous shot for the defense. So everyone is getting over a point per shot here in the corners for the season, except for Carter Bryant and Castle this season. So Carter Bryant's almost there at 31%, and then Castle's there as well at 31%. So both players are close, but they're not quite there in the corners. And regarding who are like the top 3 players who get the largest percentage of their shots in the corners, the players who basically live in the corners, it's Harrison Barnes shooting 40% this season. Carter Bryant shooting 31%. Again, you'd like to see that number get improve a little bit more. And then Julian Champagnie, who's shooting 39% from the corners whenever he gets a look there. Now, 2 players I want to mention who don't get as many corner looks because, again, they're not usually operating from the corners. They're usually operating up top or inside the paint, is Fox and Wemby. But whenever they do get corner threes, wow, they dangerous. Both Fox and Wemby are shooting 49%. Fox is at 49% and Wemby at 48% on corner three. So again, even though they're not usually out there on that area of the floor on a possession, if they end up there, it's a very good shot. It's a very good chance that it's going to go in the shot when it's either Fox or Wemby. So again, they've really improved there. And so what you really see is when you look at the percentage of shots from the corner, you see that a lot of the on-ball players who really run the offense, guys like, Wemby, Harper, Castle, Fox, they're usually the lower players in terms of getting their most amount of shots from the corners because, again, they don't usually operate from that range. They're usually the guys creating, getting inside the paint, and then opening up and passing out to those players there in the corner. But again, very good marks there in the corners, and you're just hoping that Bryant and who is it, Castle, can improve their corner 3-point percentage. Now let's look at distance of the defender. So using data from NBA.com, let's first look at wide open three. So a wide open three, again, is defined as when a defender is more than 6 feet away from the player taking the shot. So again, here, Harper, Castle, Bryant, Barnes, and Keldon see over half their threes taken wide open. So again, defenses are daring most nights for these players to shoot, or like these are the players that they're willing to back off of a little bit. And so everyone's shooting, pretty well there, except for the younger players. So Harper's at 29% on wide open threes now for the season. Castle is almost there, above a point per shot at it says 33%, but it's like probably like 32 point something, 0.5 or above percent. And then same thing for Carter Bryant. He's almost there at 33%. So again, those players are starting to increase their range there, or their accuracy on those wide open threes, considering that is a shot that defenses are willing to give them. And even like guys like Harrison Barnes and Keldon Johnson, they shoot the three very well from that wide open three. But again, defensive, because they're lower volume shooters, defenses are more willing to leave them open to help out on someone else. These wide open threes are going to be the bigger test, I think, in the playoffs for the Spurs. I think defenses are going to figure out different schemes to try to limit the paint as much as possible, or sending help toward Wemby, and leaving some of those questionable shooters open that even though the numbers might say they're shooting well, that maybe the low volume that the defense doesn't trust. So again, I think that that's still an area to watch, because even when I ran my numbers on the strengths and weaknesses of the Spurs on offense through 70 games, again, there's a lot of strengths. It's really hard to find weaknesses, but one of their weaknesses still is that wide open 3-point accuracy as a team by game 70. Now let's look at the open three, how the Spurs are shooting on open threes, and an open three is defined as now the defender's a little bit closer, the defender's 4 to 6 feet away. So again, kind of in the vicinity, but not still it's still considered an open three. So every Spur is getting over a point per shot on their open threes, except Castle, who is at 28%. So at least he's improved that number up to 28%. Now, the players who see most of their shots coming here in terms of percentage of shots from three, it's Devin Vassell, who's shooting 36%. De'Aaron Fox, who's shooting 34%, and then Wemby, who's shooting 36% on open threes, and also Julian Champagnie says his fair share, shooting 34% there on open threes. Again, so those are open threes. Now let's look at totally open threes. This is one a stat I guess I made up. So it's basically just putting wide open threes and open threes together. So it's basically the defenders as close as 4 feet or further away. So let's just see how the players are doing here. So Castle, Harper, Bryant, Barnes, Keldon, and Fox are getting over 90% of their shots that are taken totally open. Again, the defender is either as close as 4 feet or further away. And so the players who are shooting well here on these totally open threes are Barnes, 38%, Keldon, 38%, Fox is at 35%, so at least over a point per shot. Now, the players that are still struggling, but again, they're getting almost all of their threes totally open, are Castle, who's improved up to 32%, Dylan Harper, who's improved up to 30%, and then Carter Bryant, who's improved up to 33%. Again, these are the kind of threes that I think that teams are going to force players to take to shrink the paint inside when the playoffs do come. So we're going to see how the Spurs handle those being left open for some of these kind of threes in the playoffs. This next one was one that really surprised me when I ran the data on Friday, in the 70 game review. It was the catch and shoot threes for the Spurs. I mean, every single rotation player except Luke Cornett, because he doesn't take any, is shooting 34% or better now for the season on catch and shoot threes. I mean, everyone is shooting, again, 34% or better. So this is important, because these are the types of threes that the Spurs are very good at generating with their offense, whether it's their drive and kick action with their guards, Castle, Fox, Harper getting to the paint and kicking out, spraying out to shooters, or it's Wemby, waiting, getting a double team, then looking for the next player and kicking it out and finding that player for an open, a good catch and shoot three. This is a very, very good number here, the fact that they're all shooting 34% or better, everyone in the rotation. And so what we do see too is that most of the players do take this shot as their primary shot for a three, except for Fox. He's the only player who 48% of his shots are coming as catch and shoots. The rest of the players are all 67% or more of their shots, their 3-point shots come as catch and shoot threes. Now, this really shows the growth, like I mentioned, from players like the young players like Castle, Harper, and Bryant, where Castle's up to 35% on catch and shoot threes. Bryant's up to 34%, but Harper, look at Harper. He's now making 37% of his catch and shoot threes. So again, very good numbers there on the catch and shoot three. And again, that's the best kind of three that the Spurs are able to generate. It's also one of the more efficient kind of threes for a player to take. All right, now when it comes to the pull-up three, this one is not pretty good really for anyone except for Keldon. But again, Keldon rarely takes them. So Keldon's the only player getting over a point per shot on his pull-up threes. He's making it's a very, very, very small sample size, just 9 of 18 for the season, 50%. But again, he doesn't really go to that shot. The player who really goes to that shot a lot is De'Aaron Fox, where 49% of his threes come on the pull-up threes. And early in the season, he was actually shooting very well. He was shooting like 36%, 39% at one time on pull-up threes. But that shot has really gone away from him. He's now at 30% for the season. So again, if the Spurs don't have to rely on this shot, that's a good thing for their offense. They could, if they can more so try to generate those catch and shoot threes in the playoffs, that's going to help them in the long run, because as you see here by the data, these everybody's in pink or below a point per shot here on their pull-up threes. One thing I do want to note is that the guards, when playoff time comes, is they have to be more disciplined, as Stephon Castle's kind of shown, as I mentioned last week in a pod, in not settling for these pull-up threes. The reason why is because defenses will either go under, which is inviting a player to take that pull-up three because it's wide open, or they're going to back off the player, the driving player, someone like Castle, someone like a Fox or Harper, because they don't want them to beat them going into the paint and, creating havoc in there. So they'll give them 4 to 6 feet of space, back off, and kind of, invite them to take that pull-up three, which of course the defense wants. But like I mentioned, when I was looking at Castle's data last week in his 3-point shooting, he really took that shot completely out of his diet. So he knows that defenses want him to do that, but he's not doing that. He's only waiting to take a three unless it's a catch and shoot three. And so again, I think that's something where the guards need to really stay disciplined as much as possible in the playoffs, because again, that might be the only shot that a defense is providing to them. And so you got to try to just kind of move the offense around a little bit more, try to attack inside, try to do something else to not just settle for that pull-up three, because again, as you see here from the data, it is the shot that a lot of the Spurs players on this roster do struggle with. All right, so now that I mentioned how much the Spurs have improved in their 3-point shooting, in different areas so far this season, which is why they're now a top 5 offense. Let's kind of look at some of the areas where they've been pretty good this entire year, which is attacking, of course, inside. So let's first begin by looking at their shooting in the restricted area, or which I like to which is termed the dunk layup range. The closest area to the basket within 4 feet. So, everyone, shoots well from here. They they at least get over a point per shot, they're in the paint. The top 5 players who really live inside here and get closest to the rim on their shots are Luke Cornett, Dylan Harper, Keldon Johnson, Stephon Castle, and Wemby. Fox, though, I will add, when he's getting some of those double-digit paint games lately, as he's been doing over the last month, he is also getting right at the rim and finishing, whether it's layups or dunks. So again, Fox has also been getting closer there to the rim. Next, let's look at the non-restricted area, or the floater range shot. This is not for any offense, not just the Spurs. This is usually not a good shot you want in your offense. It's a very low efficient percentage, that distance of outside of 4 feet all the way to 15 feet within the paint. Again, that's a very difficult shot. Luckily for the Spurs, they don't have a ton of players who take most of their shots here. The only players who take over 20% of their shots here are Fox, but he's very good in this area. I will say that about Fox from the paint range, from that floater range. He's making 54% of his shots here, and again, he's really good about driving inside, getting a little separation inside the paint, and then settling for not really a floater, but more so his paint jumper. He's very comfortable with that shot. That's a very good shot for him. Stephon Castle, 24% of his shots come from here, but he's only shooting 40%. So again, in the playoffs, maybe they're hoping that he doesn't take as many shots from there. But Keldon Johnson, this is one of his go-to shots where he's very good, I will say. 23% of Keldon's shots come here in the paint, and you see him when he drives inside, maybe puts his back to the defender. And whether it's a small or a big, he's really good about using his hook shot. And Keldon's doing very well here, making 52% of his floater range shots. So again, for Fox and Keldon, this is a very good shot. It's a good sign that they're taking this shot. For the rest of the players, they don't really go to this shot much in their offense. And as you'll see on the video, all of them are pretty much in red or in pink, struggling to make shots from here. All right, now when we put the restricted area and non-restricted area, or dunk layup range and floater range together, we get, of course, the paint numbers, just overall how players are shooting in the paint. So, everyone's shooting pretty well in the paint. The only player who's under 50% here is Carter Bryant, but that's more so because, we know that early in the season, Bryant was a rookie, getting only spot minutes in the first few months, and, he had trouble making some dunks at times and finishing inside, which is understandable for being a rookie and only getting spot minutes. But I will say Carter's been much better lately about attacking the rim, finishing with layups or dunks. And so I think that number, by the time the end of the season gets here, he could be over 50% from the paint, but everyone else is shooting fairly well here. I will just say that players with over half their shots coming from the paint are Luke Cornett, Keldon Johnson, Dylan Harper, and Stephon Castle. And then Wemby and Fox are right on the cusp of basically living inside the paint, with 49% of their shots coming right there in the paint. All right, and the final shot to discuss is the mid-range, which is a shot, again, that not just the Spurs, but other offenses, you don't want them taking that shot because it's not a good shot. It's a very inefficient shot, the mid-range. And so luckily for the Spurs, a lot of their players do stay away from this shot. The only player who takes over 20% of his shots from here is Devin Vassell. But that's because Devin Vassell is a very, very, elite mid-range shooter. He's taking 22% of his shots from mid-range. He's making 51% of them. So again, over a point per shot for Vassell. Wemby and Fox will go to it, but not as much in their offense anymore, like I mentioned earlier. And when they do go to it, it's they're both shooting 43% there from mid-range. But like I said, that was definitely a go-to shot for Victor in that win against Phoenix. But again, it's a good sign that the Spurs are not, settling there for a lot of mid-rangers for most of their players. So as I wrote Friday, it's getting tougher and tougher to find weaknesses for the Spurs, especially with how much they've really improved in their outside shooting. We'll see what defenses devise against them in the playoffs here in a few weeks when the playoffs do begin, because I think that's the one thing that the defenses are going to try to do is really try to stall them on offense. And I think that when playoff time does come, while the offenses might face some hurdles, I think that the defense is going to be the area where the Spurs that can be their anchor, where they can really rely on their defense every night in the postseason, just like they relied on it in that night against Phoenix recently this past week when they were struggling on offense, with their outside shooting and struggling to score, but their defense held them in that game against Phoenix, and then of course it allowed Victor to go out there and make that game winner. Let's keep going. All right, before I close this episode, let's look ahead to the week to this week's slate of games. So the Spurs do only have 3 games this week, which is really nice to only have a night off every other day, not have to do some back-to-back. So, and it's actually a fairly favorable schedule for the Spurs. So let's first begin by looking at the Spurs in their last 10 games. They are 9-1. They have the best offense in the league during the stretch, 11th best defense, and they have the 2nd best net rating. So on Monday, the Spurs are on the road in Miami to play the Heat. For the second time this season, the Heat are 6-4 in their last 10. They have the 8th ranked offense during the stretch, the 17th ranked defense, and the 11th best net rating. So because the Heat defense is ranked 17th, I'm going to go ahead and say the Spurs win this game. Again, if the Spurs are really hot right now on offense, and so if you don't have like a top tier defense against them, I think that San Antonio can do what they want on offense. So I'm going to take the Spurs. I do want to note about injury concerns. Devin Vassell and Stephon Castle are both questionable to play in this game. And then Norman Powell, Andrew Wiggins, and Jaime Jaquez Jr. are all either questionable or probable to play in this game as well for the Heat. Then on Wednesday, the Spurs are on the road in Memphis to play the Grizzlies. I believe this is for the final time this season. The Grizzlies are struggling right now. Of course, they're dealing with a bunch of injuries. Also, trying to improve their lottery odds at times. So the Grizzlies are 1-9 in their last 10. But I will say that one win was against the Denver Nuggets, a team that defeated the Spurs recently. So that is something to keep in mind if a team's not ready for the Grizzlies. And remember, the Grizzlies did upset the Spurs earlier this year at one point. So the Grizzlies are struggling on offense, or they're 18th on offense. I mean, actually, that's not too bad, but it's defense they're really struggling. They're 28th on defense in the last 10 games, and they also have a minus 10.4 net rating, which is 25th during the stretch. So because the Grizzlies are struggling on defense, that's going to allow the Spurs to do whatever they want on offense. So I'm going to go ahead and take the Spurs. And then finally, the Spurs close out the week on Saturday on the road in Milwaukee to end their 3-game road trip. The Bucks are 3-7 in their last 10 games. They are struggling on offense, 24th ranked offense during the stretch. They're also struggling on defense, 27th ranked defense to in the stretch. But they also beat some decent teams too. I think they beat the Suns recently. They have a minus 11.3 net rating during the stretch, 26. So again, because they have a bad offense and a bad defense, I am going to take the Spurs in this game as well. So I think that the Spurs should go 3-0 this week. Vegas is probably going to say the Spurs need to go 3-0 as well. If there is a letdown, it would probably be that game on Monday against the Miami Heat. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this episode of the Spotted Pod. If you like what you heard, please subscribe and leave us a rating on your favorite podcast apps and our YouTube channel. The Spotted Pod is recorded and produced by Paul Garcia. The music for this episode was written by Vincent Garcia and Paul Garcia. Thank you for listening and have a great day.